C-SPAN at the House Committee on Ways and Means. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mr. Smith, Mr. Marchant. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It is just past 1:40.
Testing 1 2 3 4. Testing testing 1 2 3 4. A B C D E F G. Testing testing 1 2 3 4. A B C D E F G. Testing testing testing. Testing testing 1 2 3 4. Testing testing. This is a test of the audio system. 1100 Longworth, Ways and Means. Testing testing testing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to the Subcommittee Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. Welcome all the witnesses and all the folks in the audience here today to listen to the testimony that we're anxious to hear. And I'm sure you're anxious to get the questions that we have for you to share additional information. But before we get started, let me just make a few comments. As many of you know, U.S. farmers, ranchers, and growers right now are caught in the middle of an international crossfire. First, they are hurt because products such as equipment, chemicals, and fertilizer, which they need to run lean and competitive agriculture operations, have been included on the administration's Section 301 list, as well as the steel and aluminum they need. And then adding insult to injury, they are the first to face retaliatory tariffs from across the globe as countries react to U.S. trade policy decisions. In fact, U.S. agriculture now are facing retaliatory tariffs from the EU, from China, Mexico, Canada, Turkey, Russia, and India. Now, I know that the administration didn't intend for the U.S. agriculture to be hurt or harmed, but the damage is entirely predictable. As some of you know well, low commodity prices have been sort of the practice of the last several years, very challenging for American farmers to even survive and exist and operate at a profit. And what we're hearing from farmers, ranchers, producers, and fishermen in my home state of Washington and many other states across the country is that U.S. agriculture just isn't in a healthy place, and that's putting it mildly. Most of our agriculture producers today rely heavily on export markets, and unfortunately, many of these farmers and producers are now facing the loss of not just one of their top international export markets, not just their number one market, but their number two market, their number three market, and their number four market, all at once. They are facing severe and devastating uncertainty, and that goes right to their profitability. Now, it's important to acknowledge that the President is absolutely correct that we need to stand up to China's unfair, predatory trade practices, including overcapacity in steel and aluminum, IP theft, and other Chinese policies that endanger the innovative technologies developed by U.S. companies. As we take on China, though, we must take into account the effects of U.S. agriculture, like the examples we'll hear today. I've heard heart-wrenching stories in some cases of farmers and families already scrambling to make ends meet, who are forced to make difficult decisions to cope with the uncertainty caused by these tariffs. They don't know what and how much they should plant. They are having trouble getting financing, and they are forced to put expansion plans on hold. Entire rural communities are affected when farmers are struggling. Their supplies and workers and even banks, restaurants, and school districts are struggling. And as we learn about the challenges that many people in the ag sector are facing, it's critical to remember that many family farmers have invested everything that they have in their farms, their orchards, or their ranches. And sometimes these have been in their families for generations. This is serious business. It is their livelihood. It is their life. And even worse, our small farmers and producers are suffering the most because they already are running on tight margins without the economies of scale that the larger producers can benefit from. In Washington State, one winery has already lost $500,000 in export sales after China imposed tariffs in retaliation for the Section 232 tariffs. Their shipments dropped by 50% in the second quarter alone. In another sector, USDA reported that China canceled nearly $140 million in soybean contracts at the end of June. And as you will hear in a few minutes from our witnesses from Washington State, cherry producers are really feeling the pinch during their short cherry season as they face an additional 25% tariff and China. This is their top export market. Today, we'll hear from a broad range of American agricultural producers about the real-world impact of increased tariffs. And I'm eager to hear from our witnesses today and learn how these tariffs are affecting their farms, families, and communities. Our hearing will focus on both U.S. tariff increases related to the Section 232 action on steel and aluminum and the Section 301 tariffs on China, as well as retaliatory tariffs from around the world. And I look forward to learning from our excellent panel of witnesses today. Some have traveled a long way to be here with us, and we'll continue to engage with the President, with the members of the administration, and how we reach a durable solution to the challenging trade agenda. And I, for one, have urged the President to restore the exemptions from steel and aluminum tariffs for Mexico and Canada. I've twice mentioned this to Secretary Ross, and he has made a promise that he would mention it to the President and seek an answer from him on this issue. These are two of America's most trusted allies that are also incredibly important markets for our agricultural exports. At the same time, I am encouraging the President to push forward with our negotiations with our international trading partners, including with China, to find a solution that evens the playing field for American workers, manufacturers, service providers, and farmers, while at the same time making sure that farmers don't become collateral damage. We also cannot lose sight of the cost of inaction when it comes to new markets. When our trading partners move forward and make other agreements, and we're not included, our farmers, our workers, and our businesses fall behind. They lose their market. I will now yield to Ranking Member Pascrell for the purposes of his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know the great affection I have for you, of deep respect, so I don't want you to, in any manner, shape, or form, interpret what I'm about to say in any disrespectful way. And if you think it is, I will apologize. That's how much I think about you. We worked on too many things together.
True.
And we're going to miss you.
Thank you.
I want to welcome our witnesses. On behalf of the committee, Democrats, we look forward to hearing from you. I've read your testimonies about the impacts of the administration's tariffs on your communities. Make no mistake about it, we are in a slippery slope. We don't know where it's going to end, and we don't really know all the consequences, which is a chaotic policy. So we've been asking this committee to hold more regular subcommittee hearings. So our meeting today is welcome. But I have to say, we are deeply disappointed that the committee Republicans did not call an administration witness to this hearing to explain the President's erratic trade actions. We get them in private meetings, in private consultations, nothing in public before any part of this committee. That is unacceptable. This is not transparency. This is delusion. Last week, committee Democrats sent Chairman Brady a letter requesting a full Ways and Means Committee hearing with an administration witness so we could demand answers. The American people deserve answers more than the Congress. Answers about policies of a trade, whether or not they're working, and that request stands. No one on the Ways and Means Committee, no one in the administration can say that as the ranking member for the Democrats on trade, I have given everyone the benefit of the doubt of Mr. Lighthouser and his staff. So, I accepted some Democratic criticism that I was not strong enough on the quote-unquote other side. We don't know who the other side is, by the way. We are talking to diverse groups, because many on this committee chose a different path, and that's why you're here today. If the administration was running this hearing, you wouldn't be here. I'll tell you that. So, we're having a subcommittee hearing, and there's no administration witnesses. So, whether we're talking about soybeans and the price in the United States and Brazil, we know what that has happened, what's happened there, or whether we're talking about steel, all boats must rise. I said that last year when I took the position. I say it now. There are too many losers right now, and we must do something about it. I'm all for fact-finding, but calling on Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue to testify today could shed some important light on the administration's tariff strategy with respect to our farmers. And Mr. Chairman, before I continue, I am considering not coming to any more private meetings except if the administration is here and is open to the public. I'm considering that right now. And I trust you, but I'm telling you what I think in terms of the overall picture. I like to return to regular order, but that's true in both parties. We have not had that opportunity. Public meetings are important. Administration must be here to defend the position. Now, I had not a different policy when Mr. Obama was the president. The subcommittee is scheduled for a hearing on 232 steel and aluminum exclusion process next week. Correct me if I'm wrong. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross should be here listening to our witnesses as well and be held accountable for this administration's irrational actions. For too long, free trade has benefited some industries and corporations over others, often at the expense of American workers, Mr. Chairman, particularly in manufacturing. Trade enforcement is critical to defending the interests of those who've been left behind in globalization and free trade. Might I just be able to finish?
I'm sure you're going to be talking later.
I think
Go ahead. I'll give you another.
I think you can bet on that.
I'll give you. I know I can bet on. I'll give you a few more seconds.
Thank you. Tariffs are one tool that can be effective in enforcing fairer trade policies and bringing cheating actors like China to the table. But they also could be used as weapons, and I think they're being used as weapons against you. Let me say that now. Trade with China, my last sentence,
Okay.
whose unfair trade props up its own industries at our expense, has eliminated or displaced millions of United States jobs and contributed to a reduction in American wages over the last 20 years. And I thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. We all have passionate feelings around this issue. It's become one that, as you can see, we have a full committee here today. We are serious about this issue, and that's why we have you here today. We want to know what you think. We want to know the impact fully from, straight from your mouth and from the people that you represent. Although the ranking member is passionate and has described some actions or inactions that have occurred or not occurred over the past few months regarding trade, let me just make the record clear on just a couple of points. Earlier this spring, we held 2 full committee hearings on, okay, I thought you were going to ask for me to yield. Earlier this spring, we held 2 full committee hearings on trade agenda, tariffs, and trade agreements, one with Ambassador Lighthizer and one with Secretary Ross. And we will continue to hold them accountable and ask for other hearings. We also held a full committee hearing with the private sector witnesses on tariffs. We are holding this hearing today on the impact of tariffs tariffs on agriculture, to gather information about how the agricultural community has been affected. And it's important for us to engage with the stakeholders. We will hold a hearing next Tuesday, as the ranking member mentioned, on the broken product exclusion process, and again, gathering evidence from stakeholders about how the process is working or not working and how it can be improved. We also had committee delegations at 2 of the NAFTA rounds where we met with USTR officials, one in Montreal and one in Mexico City. Every member was invited to attend. We've also held countless staff consultations with the administration, and as Mr. Pascrell has mentioned, private meetings with Secretary Ross and Ambassador Lighthizer, and there may have been one with Mr. Navarro, if I'm not mistaken. But these are steps that we're continuing to take, and we want to engage with the administration and with our friends on both sides of the aisle, because it's going to take all of us to resolve these issues, to make sure that our ag producers are successful today and into the future, and that your farms that have been in your families for generations continue to remain in your family for generations to come. And so today, we want to welcome all of us on the panel. I want to welcome our 6 witnesses. And first, I'd like to offer a special welcome to our first witness from Washington State, Mr. Case Gebhards, President and CEO of Gebhards Farm and the member of the Northwest Horticultural Council. Gebhards Farms is a great family farm that is the world's largest producer of cherries and tends to be one of the biggest contiguous apple orchards in the world, in addition to raising cattle. Our second witness is Russell Baining, owner of Loma Vista Farms and Baining Brothers Dairy Incorporated and president of the Texas Farm Bureau. Our third witness is Kevin Popp, a corn and soybean farmer and president of the Minnesota Farm Bureau. And I would yield to Mr. Paulson for any additional comments of introduction that he'd like to make.
Well, real quick, Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to welcome Kevin Papp here, along with his wife Julie, who is joining him. And as a 4th-generation farmer, as you mentioned, he is going to provide the Minnesota perspective on the negative impacts of tariffs. So I welcome him.
Thank you. And our fourth witness is Scott Vanderwall, Secretary and Treasurer of Vanderwall Farms, President of the South Dakota Farm Bureau, and Vice President of the American Farm Bureau Federation. And I would yield to Representative Noem for any additional comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to introduce my friend and fellow South Dakotan Scott Vanderwall to everyone here today. I think it's imperative when we have these discussions that we have folks testifying that live the reality of these tariffs and the retaliation that we're seeing from other countries against our farmers and ranchers. And Scott has long time been a leader for agriculture across the country, and his farm and ranch is just about 45 miles south of my ranch. I've known him for many, many years, and I've appreciated his leadership, not just at the state level, but at the national level as well. So him and his wife, Michelle, have been very active. They raise corn and soybeans and have a custom cattle feeding operation. And I'm just grateful he's here to tell his story, but not just his story, the story of what every single South Dakota farmer is going through right now during these difficult times. So thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Our fifth witness is Michelle Erickson Jones, co-owner of Gooseneck Land and Cattle, president of the Montana Grain Growers Association, and a representative of Farmers for Free Trade and National Association of Wheat Growers. Our sixth and last witness is Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities. Before recognizing our first witness, let me note that our time is limited to the witnesses and the members. Let me please limit your testimony to 5 minutes and questions to 5 minutes. And members, please, I hope that we can adhere to the 5-minute rule as closely as possible. Mr. Gebhards, your written statement will be made part of the record, but you're recognized for 5 minutes. Turn on your microphone, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Reichert and Ranking Member Pascrell, for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on the effect that these tariffs, in particular those that have been imposed on agriculture products like cherries, apples, and pears, in retaliation for the U.S. trade policies that are really unrelated to agriculture these past few months. and the effect that it's having on growers such as myself and my family, and really all those families of small farmers that we represent. I'm Cass Gebers, President and CEO of Gebers Farms in Brewster, Washington, and we farm next door to Mr. Reichert's district. Gebers Farms is a century-old, multi-generational family company located in a very rural community of Washington State, Brewster. 3 of my siblings and I are the 4th generation, with 15 of my kids, nieces, and nephews from that 5th generation working around us every day. Only 1 year or 2 years separate the 5th from the 6th generation, so our roots go deep in farming of tree fruits and cattle and timber. We grow fruit on approximately 13,500 acres, with about 10,000 of those being in apples and 3,000 in cherries and 500 in pears. Our sales company represents another 21,000 acres of our neighbors, 400 small growers that are members of a local cooperative, plus a couple of other independents. 30% of all of that fruit is exported. So we really are heavily reliant upon foreign markets, over 40 of those different countries that we export to. Those 400 families are employing between 8,000 and 9,000 people on a seasonal and daily basis. Gebers Farms also raises Black Angus cattle on about 120,000 acres, with 50,000 of those being on Forest Service, State of Washington, and Game Department lands. We also graze those lands, and we harvest timber. We have to compete against imported timber from those lands, and it's closed almost all the mills in our north central Washington area. I believe there's only 1 sawmill still operating. So trade is huge in our neck of the woods. So in effect, we're all stewards of the environment where we carve out our existence caring for this great land. I'm going to focus my testimony today on the impact that these tariffs are having on the tree farm portion of our business. The Pacific Northwest is home to many family-owned orchards that jointly supply 3/4 of the fresh apples, 88% of the cherries, and 88% of the fresh pears, and 81% of the cherries sold in the United States. So we're very heavily weighted towards the tree fruits. Together, these crops are valued at about $3.8 to $4 billion annually and create tens of thousands of jobs in our local communities, many of which are small and rural, like my own hometown of Brewster. Our growers lead the nation in exports, with approximately 1/3 of all the apples, pears, and cherries grown in our region are exported out of the U.S. Exporting fruit creates a huge layer of additional risk. We get laid in with inconsistent clearance policies at foreign ports. Hostile countries reject fruit. They'll hold this perishable fruit till it rots, sometimes under unjustified phytosanitary concerns to maybe protect their industries, or to just be vindictive on retaliating on another trade program. Keep in mind that the further these delays go down the chain, the more we eat as growers, and the more it punishes us as growers, because we've already sunk those numbers into our crop. So when we have a load consumed in China through an inspection process or heavily taxed, that goes back to the grower, because there's no way to pass that back on. We've tried that. Unfortunately, in the past 4 months, we have faced a multitude of additional and new trade barriers that have completely been outside of our control. The consequences, and I'll just address perishable. We can't store this crop. I can't turn my cows out. I can turn my cows out for another 6 months and wait out the storm maybe, or delay those fat cattle, or store some hay. I can't do that with cherries. They're rotten in 30 days, 30 to 40 days. We need to move them. Apples are perishable. Once you've committed them to a box, they have to be moved. China's our #1 market for cherries, #5 on apples, and #9 on pears, and it's basically, we're paying up to 50% in tariffs, and if you add the VAT tax on, it's another 10%.
Your time has expired, Mr.
That was
Rivers.
quick.
Yeah, it does go fast, doesn't it?
Yep.
We're going to come back to you, though, and you'll have an opportunity to share additional information. So
Okay.
thank you for your testimony. Mr. Baining.
Good afternoon, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Pascrell, and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity. My name is Russell Bading. I'm from Post, Texas. My family and I make our living by farming and ranching. We grow feed grains, wheat, cotton, and watermelons. We also operate a 500-cow dairy and have a beef cattle operation. I currently serve as president of the Texas Farm Bureau and a member of the American Farm Bureau Federation Board of Directors. I chair the AFBF Trade Advisory Committee. International trade is a major driver of Texas agriculture economy. We rely on trade each and every day to market the products that we work hard to grow. In fact, about 25% of the U.S. farm income is derived from selling ag products internationally. We are concerned with the blowback from the administration's decision to place tariffs on our trading partners. Agriculture is bearing the brunt of retaliation at a time when farmers are already facing low commodity prices, some high input costs, and of course, unpredictable weather. Net farm income has dropped 52% in the last 5 years, making it extremely difficult for farmers and ranchers to continue operating. The addition of a trade war comes at a time that we can ill afford it. We are also concerned that many of the benefits of the tax reform, which are helping many of our farmers and ranchers, will be nullified due to the retaliatory measures on U.S. ag products. On our own farm, we just finished harvesting grain sorghum. We have seen a decline in the market price of 25% in the last 2 months. We're going to store most of this crop and hope that the prices will go back up. This will be an extra cost, but as true optimists, we are hopeful that the market will improve. We will begin cotton harvest in about 6 weeks against a backdrop of significant volatility in the market. 46% of the cotton that's exported to China comes from Texas. Any potential loss of this important market would be very difficult for our cotton farmers. On our dairy, we have already seen the price of milk fall by more than 10% over the last month alone. These are just a few of my personal examples. There are many other farmers and ranchers who are facing the same challenges with all of the uncertainty over trade policy. Furthermore, placing tariffs on our closest trading partners, particularly Canada and Mexico, is concerning. Texas Farm Bureau believes that we must continue working toward a strong, modernized North American free trade agreement. Ideally, this deal would be wrapped up as soon as possible while refraining from doing anything that limits investment protections. Now, while agriculture is bearing the brunt of retaliation for things that have absolutely nothing to do with agriculture, this is not unfamiliar territory for us. For years, the agriculture community has been highlighting the egregious tariff and non-tariff trade barriers being erected by our trading partners. So while we do have serious concerns about the retaliation we are facing, we must commend President Trump and his administration for working to address the problems that have existed for decades. I'll give you one example. In 2015, China's minimum support price for corn, rice, and wheat was estimated to be nearly $100 billion in excess of the levels China committed to when they joined the World Trade Organization. So let me be clear on this. For just 3 crops in 1 year, China illegally exceeded its WTO limits by $100 billion. Putting this into context, we just finished a hard-fought Farm Bill debate where some people questioned the need for support provided to our farmers. But China's illegal subsidies for those 3 crops in 1 year exceeded what we will spend on the entire farm safety net for every crop on every acre for the entire life of the Farm Bill. Yes, we must have ag trade in China, and yes, we appreciate their business. However, we must address this blatant abuse that extends beyond just China. If our president is successful, and we desperately want and need him to be sooner rather than later, this could be a tremendous opportunity for agricultural trade. But absent a successful outcome, farm and ranch families like ours will suffer. No one wants the administration to be more successful in this effort than we do. But it is important to know that these decisions have the potential to greatly damage our livelihoods. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. Be glad to answer any questions later. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Papp, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Kevin Papp. As mentioned, I, along with my wife Julie, is here today grow corn and soybeans in Blue Earth County, Minnesota. I'm the Minnesota Farm Bureau State President. Minnesota Farm Bureau strongly believes that with the current financial stress farmers and ranchers are facing, we need to maintain and expand our market opportunities. We are truly blessed. We grow more than we need. The current tariffs, continuing back and forth retaliatory actions, and trade uncertainties are hitting American agriculture from all sides and are causing us to lose our markets. Once you lose a market, it's really hard to get it back. Agriculture is facing the perfect storm. Trade uncertainties, decade lows in farm income, agriculture labor shortages, and the uncompleted farm bill. It's quickly becoming more than we can handle. In trade wars, agriculture has been and continues to be the tip of the spear. All commodities are being impacted. But in Minnesota, we're hearing the most from our members that are growing soybeans and raising pigs. Page 3 of my written testimony clearly shows what trade uncertainty has done to our prices. Low prices are causing serious negative impacts on our farm income. Bottom line, lost sales lead to lower prices. Many decisions in farming are not made week to week. We have to make decisions a long time before our crops are planted, much less harvested. We understand that there are things out of our control like the weather. We can manage some of that risk through crop insurance and other risk management tools. What we didn't know was the level of trade tensions we would be experiencing and the serious price impacts they have on our crops as we move closer to harvest. The impacts of tariffs on prices is what's keeping us up at night. Clearly, there are significant economic challenges, not only in agriculture, but also in our rural communities. Agriculture exports are important economic drivers. If you lose the market, it's really hard to get it back. We cannot afford to lose our place at the table as a leader in the global marketplace. We need to be at the table. If we're not at the table, we will be on the menu. Tariffs are severely impacting our 3 largest markets, Canada, Mexico, and China. Canada, Mexico, and China accounted for 43% of our farm exports last year. President Trump often talks about our need to export things that we make, but from a rural America perspective, we also need to export more of the things we grow. We recognize that over 95% of the world's population does not live in the United States. We must work together to protect, modify, and modernize our current trade agreements. We must be at the table. We must expand our market opportunities through new trade agreements. Minnesota Farm Bureau strongly believes that we need to resolve the trade concerns before resorting to tariffs. It is critical that we limit trade disruptions and resolve trade disputes through negotiations, not tariffs, and not withdrawals from other trade agreement discussions. We must be at the table. Once you lose a market, it's really tough to get it back. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this subcommittee and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, and Mr. Vanderwall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Pascrell, members of the subcommittee. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Vanderwall. I'm a farmer from Volga, South Dakota. We have a family operation, as Representative Noe mentioned, where my father is still involved at 82 years old. He likes to do the feedlot chores whenever he can, and my son, who's there learning to manage probably earlier than he would have because I'm doing things like this. So it's good for him as well. I currently serve as president of the South Dakota Farm Bureau and also have the honor and privilege of serving as vice president of American Farm Bureau Federation. My testimony today will focus on the growing concerns of farmers and ranchers across the country due to the impact of tariffs on farming and ranching, and also the impacts on South Dakota. Our farmers are facing a lot of challenges right now. Since 2014, the American farmer's income has fallen 52%. Now farmers are dealing with big shifts in the commodity markets because of trade and tariff threats. Throughout history, some farmers have survived by expanding their operations. Today, that option is nearly untouchable because of the lack of qualified labor and access to land. The ingredients of this perfect storm, as President Papp said, trade threats, Lower income, the lack of labor, and possibly no farm bill will be more than many farmers can handle. We need Congress and the administration to remember that agriculture has traditionally been a bright spot in our nation's overall balance of trade. In 2017, we had a positive trade balance of $21 billion in regard to ag exports. We will quickly lose our place as a leader in the global marketplace, however, if we can't be trusted as a trading partner and our farmers no longer have access to markets that they depend on. Multiple rounds of U.S. tariff announcements and subsequent retaliatory tariffs by China have now led to large cumulative tariffs that would completely price U.S. ag products out of foreign markets. Similar negative effects are expected from the retaliatory tariffs that have been imposed by Canada, Mexico, and the European Union because of the U.S. imposed steel and aluminum tariffs. And now to some specific impacts on South Dakota. According to the USDA Foreign Ag Service, 95% of the exports from our state go to the top steel exports. 84% of our exports go to the top aluminum exporters. Obviously, these markets are very crucial to us, and the retaliatory tariffs on our products hurt our state tremendously. I'm hearing more from farmers as time goes along that they still trust what President Trump is doing and that he knows what he's doing and that everything will be fine in the end. We understand that other countries, particularly China, have not played fairly, and we respect his desire to remedy those situations. The problem is those countries know just where to punch us back in a dispute situation, and that's agricultural products. Through no fault of our own, and unintentionally, I believe, our industry ends up being used for leverage. Patience among farmers is running out as we get closer to the main selling season. As of yesterday, since the end of May, new crop soybean futures have dropped about $2 a bushel, or 20%, and corn has dropped about 65 cents a bushel. The markets react daily to the trade wars and tariff news, and if sales have to be made at these price levels, this whole issue will show up as a massive shortfall in expected income on our financial statements. Specifically for our small farm in South Dakota, this amounts to a negative impact of about $150,000 for corn and beans alone. Farmers and ranchers are among the most patriotic people in the world, but going bankrupt should not be a consequence of that dedication. Now, I want to make it crystal clear that we appreciate most of President Trump's efforts so far, such as reducing unnecessary regulations and taking a more conservative approach to issues that affect our industry the most. However, he does need to know that the ag industry has not participated in the current economic uptrend that we're seeing, and reductions in income due to long-term trade disputes only make matters worse. We must ask, what is the exact goal? What is the exit strategy? If we knew this would all be over within a few months, we could hang in there and manage around it, but none of us know what that time frame is. We know that bankers are extremely worried. Ag lending is largely based on personal relationships. Lenders often work very long-term with their customers, and they become friends. They're members of the same community. They watch their kids play in sports together. The last thing a lender wants to do is sit across the desk from one of his customers and say, "I'm sorry, but we can't renew your loan for this next year. You're out of business." I'm not exaggerating when I say that. That could become commonplace if trade wars don't end soon. A banker I talked to yesterday made an interesting comment. He said, "Driving around the countryside, the crops look fantastic. It's just too bad that there's not a drop of black ink out there." Rather than fixing all the problems at once, we would suggest a more targeted approach. Get the Mexico and Canada deals done, then move on to China. We urge our trade officials to engage in discussions to resolve trade concerns. We must get back to the table and get these issues worked out. If we can't do that, the consequences are dire. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Erickson-Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Pascrell, and the members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Michelle Erickson-Jones, and I'm the co-owner of Gooseneck Land and Cattle and from Broadview, Montana. I also currently serve as the president of the Montana Grain Growers Association. I'm on the board of the National Association of Wheat Growers, and I'm a member of Farmers for Free Trade. As a fourth-generation farmer, it is my honor to testify here today on the impacts of tariffs on our farm, my industry, and most importantly, my community that depends on trade for their livelihood. American agriculture is a tremendous global success story, and the wheat industry is certainly no different. As such, trade is critically important to the U.S. economy and our rural communities. Farmers across the country depend heavily on our ability to sell our commodities to the foreign consumers. We are painfully aware of the prevalence of unfair trading practices used by some countries, and we support the administration's interest in finding solutions to tariff and non-tariff barriers that impede fair trade. But what I'd like to share with you today are some examples of the impact of tariffs imposed by our own administration and by the retaliatory tariffs leveled by our trading partners. These impacts felt by farmers such as myself throughout our supply chain, from higher input costs to reduced exports and lower market prices. In May, I testified at Section 301 hearings at the International Trade Commission. As I said then and believe more strongly than ever now, while many rural American families are optimistic about the economic growth under the current administration, there is mounting concern among farmers about trade policies that would reduce access to the export markets that we depend on. There have been very few issues in my career as a farmer that have caused me to lose sleep, but these tariffs are one of them. I'd like to share some of the effects that have been directly impacted my farm and my family. The first wave started at the time the administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. For me and farmers across the country, that translated into increased costs for capital investments. For example, earlier this year, we priced a new 25,000 bushel grain bin to increase our grain storage capacity on the farm. The price was 12% higher than an identical bin we had built in 2017. As we weighed our options, the bid on bin number 2 expired, and we sought a second bid. In that time frame, the Section 232 tariffs had been enacted, and our secondary bid was 8% higher than the one we had received just a few weeks ago. That amounted to a 20% increase from a bin that we had built just a year before. The bin company attributed the difference in the final bin cost to the significant increase in the cost of steel. I learned that their domestically sourced steel suppliers had increased their price to match that of imported steel, which was subject to an additional 25% duty when imported. As a result of this dramatic cost increase and volatility in the market, we abandoned our grain storage expansion project. The implications of that not only harmed my operation, it also hurt my community. A small local construction company lost a project, a U.S. grain bin company missed a sale, and a domestic steel company had one less shipment to send out of their factory. Another unexpected outcome is something we are living through right now. Back in January, we built cattle guards for several capital improvement projects we had planned for later in the fall. A neighbor saw the finished product and asked to buy several of them from us. We agreed because we thought we would be able to utilize the profits for other investments or even to put away for a rainy day fund. Last week, I priced the steel that needed to replace the cattle guards I sold. The price of steel had increased 38%, which evaporated our profits. We will now rebuild those cattle guards at a loss. These scenarios are playing out across the nation, particularly the states that depend on agriculture. These states depend on healthy agricultural commerce for a robust economy. As our profits evaporate and our ability to spend on rural Main Street businesses or take weekends away decreases, our other top economies, including tourism and manufacturing, are negatively impacted as well. While one singular example is of a small sum of money in the big picture is not much, adding them up across our rural economy becomes a staggering sum. There are countless examples in Montana where last summer large portions of the state were on fire. Just imagine the cost of replacing fencing or other equipment with prices increasing by double digits at a time of record low prices for the agricultural commodities. The impacts on our input costs, coupled with the increased market volatility and lower farm gate prices, have further reduced our already slim margins. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, net farm income is expected to drop to a 12-year low. Now allow me to further illustrate the impacts of tariff on our top line, which is sales, especially in an industry that exports $450 million a week to China annually, 65 million of which came from Montana. China is the world's largest wheat consumer with a significant trade opportunity in their market. In the market year 2017, China was our 4th largest customer. However, when China placed a 25% retaliatory tariff against our U.S. wheat, not one shipment of wheat has been purchased from the U.S. since March. The last shipment arrived last month. And now I see that I'm running short on time, so I will wrap it up there and welcome questions.
Mr. Bernstein.
Chairman Reichert, Ranking Member Pascrell, members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today on troubling developments in international trade. With no input and too little substantive pushback from Congress, the Trump administration is actively engaged in an escalating trade war, by which I mean the imposition of new tariffs by both the U.S. and, in retaliation, our trading partners. The economic record shows that expanded trade is a net positive for growth, both here and abroad. But that same record reveals people, places, and industries that have been hurt by the trade liberalization that's taken place since the 1980s. China, for example, has often engaged in unfair trading practices, including suppressing the value of their currency to make their exports to us cheaper and ours to them more expensive. They've also dumped steel onto world markets. Their heavily subsidized steel sector increased its production by over 500% between 2000 and 2016, contributing to more than half of global overcapacity in the steel industry. I credit the Trump administration for raising these issues. But raising issues is not the same as effectively addressing them, and this administration's escalating trade war is likely to do more harm than good to American production, prices, investment, growth, and employment. The Trump administration is not helping those hurt by trade, and these latest actions are likely to hurt those helped by it. That is, by imposing a tax on imported inputs into U.S. production, by inviting retaliatory tariffs, U.S. businesses that have fruitfully tapped the benefits of globalization now face rising barriers to trade, barriers that are becoming steeper with each new round of tariffs and counter-tariffs. Based on evidence of price movements and the number of jobs by industry and area exposed to China's retaliatory tariffs, the trade war is already taking a toll on farmers and rural communities. Prices for U.S. soybeans, one of our main agricultural exports, have fallen sharply, while prices in Brazil, our main competitor for global market share in soybean exports, have climbed equally sharply. To be clear, the overall macroeconomic impacts of the trade war are thus far economically small. The tariffs will likely only slightly boost top-line inflation and lower overall GDP growth. But in targeted industry, these effects are already meting out pain to exporters facing retaliatory tariffs and importers of inputs facing higher prices on incoming intermediate goods. Also, the trade war is actively escalating, and the extent to which its impact will remain macroeconomically small is yet to be seen. Based on data from the Brookings Institution, my testimony looks at jobs exposed to China's retaliatory tariffs. While every job in affected industries is, of course, not at risk, this exercise shows the base employment exposed to China's tariffs thus far. Their analysis finds about 2 million jobs in 40 industries that produce the products on China's list, including about 400,000 farm jobs. The authors also note that the, quote, classic heartland manufacturing base jumps out, anchored by auto, SUV, and RV assembly plants in the Midwest and Upper South along Interstate 65. Likewise, the familiar Midwestern agricultural complex is visible, with counties dedicated to corn and soybeans, and led by the highly visible rural counties in the Midwest and South that are dominated by slaughterhouses. Similarly, rural fruit and nut-growing counties of the Northwest stand out as exposed, as does counties in Washington State, with its 38,000 aircraft manufacturing jobs, mostly at Boeing. In fact, in a finding I thought might catch your attention, Chair Reichert, the Brookings data find that Washington is the state with the largest share of exposed workers, 154,000, almost 5% of the total. Those hurt by trade really do need help, and while our steel industry may get some necessary relief from China's dumping, there's no rationale for levying these metal tariffs on friends such as Canada or the EU. Moreover, tariffs won't provide those whose economic prospects have been hurt by globalization with the economic opportunity they lack. Thus, I urge Congress, and especially the Republican majority, as they hold the legislative cards, to claim back its constitutional role to set tariffs. I recognize that there are some efforts afoot to do so, but they have been demonstrably toothless and ineffective thus far. I welcome the opportunity to raise my concerns about the trade war today, but this hearing is no substitute for the type of congressional action that the founders of our nation clearly articulated in the Constitution for moments like the present, when presidential overreach is so misguided and damaging. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate the statistics around Washington State. I mean, it does not surprise me, since we're the most trade-dependent state in the country. So, but thank you for those. We're going to go to questions now, so you'll have opportunities to respond to those and have more time to explain the impacts of tariffs on your businesses. But I want to go to Mr. Gebers first. Can you elaborate just a little bit on the importance of exports to your overall farming operation and your ability to continue investing in your business?
Absolutely. I'll just use China for an example. Our company exports, we grow about 4.5 million boxes of cherries. We export about 1.5 million of those to China. The state exported 3 million, so we're about 50% of all the exports of Washington and U.S. cherries leaving for China. This year, with the impact of these tariffs, we think that number is going to be cut by close to 1 million boxes, maybe a little less than 1 million, so we're planning on maybe 500,000-600,000 boxes instead of 1.5 million. Those boats have been rerouted to Vietnam or Taiwan, or they've been stuffed back into the U.S. market, which is creating extra supply and forcing down prices. All of this at the expense of our growers. And so personally, we have canceled some capital expenditure projects. We would have updated equipment. We were, have new blocks of orchard planned, new irrigation systems. And we're going to have to put those on the back burner or cancel them. And maybe having 12 guys in a van, maybe we have to cut that down to 9 guys because we're going to have to lay some families off or get rid of some guys. We have to figure out how to make it work in these tight margins.
Yep.
We can't just pass these prices on. And I'll give you an example. Cherries were about $8 a pound in China. You guys all pay about $2.99 to $1.99 on ad here at Whole Foods or Safeway. We tried to raise those cherries to $10 a pound or $11 a pound. Demand went to zero. They said cancel the orders. We're not going to want that fruit at this price. Our apples in India, when it went to 75% tariff, the orders are zero. They've dried up. Mexico is down 40% with a 20% tariff. So they're having an effect on how we as a company, we had to reshift or rejigger our export program based on what we're feeling.
And as a follow-up question to that, so once you lose those markets, how tough is it to get those markets back?
We have worked decades, guys, to build these markets. I mean, my forefathers and the forefathers of our growers, the Apple Commission in Washington is 80 years old. It took forever to develop these markets, and I'll give you a quick example. When the ports were shut down in the Northwest, and you remember that the shipping deal was a kind of a disaster, we lost those markets. And European fruit, Polish fruit, all kinds of fruit filled in on the back wave of what we left behind, and we have had a hard time getting any of those back. So what happens is if we lose some cherry business, no problem. Spain, Turkey, the EU, guys will fill in the backspace behind us and take those markets, and it's very difficult. Those relationships are long, but they're pretty short-lived when you don't fill your commitment and make a promise and do what you say you're going to do.
So when you look at long-term, the long-term impacts really are you lose market share, you lose workers, you lose revenue, you may lose your farm.
Exactly. One of the guys touched on lenders. This is our collateral for our lending institutions. They're our partners. I'm on the RoboAg Advisory Board for the U.S. We know what it's like to work with farmers day in and day out, and the finances behind that. And margins are razor thin to negative currently. So where do we absorb these extra costs? It's really tough to swallow right now.
Let me go to another topic real quick. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I've been calling on the President at the very least to restore the steel and aluminum exemptions for Canada and Mexico because they're important to national security and our trading partners and allies. Such exemptions make sense and would also limit the negative effects of steel and aluminum tariffs on two-way trade, both on our imports and counter-retaliation on our exports. Can you give me a little insight into the difference it might make for you, such as your export markets, your production costs, profitability, investment decisions, if we exempted Canada and Mexico?
Yeah, Mexico is our #1 customer for apples. Canada's close. Canada's so close to us that we actually treat them as a domestic market. I mean, if I sell Walmart in Canada, the check comes from Bentonville. It doesn't get any closer than that. It feels domestic. But if we get in a trade tit for tat, that's going to make trade, difficult to collect on accounts, to sell accounts, and those are our most important markets that we're not counting on having to go fight for. We've done that fight now for 75 and 80 years, building that.
Thank you for your answers and your testimony, and I know that others will get to respond to questions here, even some to the questions I just asked. So we're going to move to Mr. Pascrell. We've just heard a bell for votes here, so we will be interrupted. We will recess and come back. Unfortunately, we'll be gone for a little bit. Mr. Pascrell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support everything you said. I read your testimony beforehand, checked into it. I don't care what your politics are, because what we're learning from you is what affects you in your states and on your particular farms and your particular ventures affects the people in my city in Paterson, New Jersey. They are consumers that go to the shop, right, you mentioned, and buy the product. By the way, best cherries in 5 years right now. The best. And I'm glad you didn't raise it to $10 a pound, but I understand your point. The question is, we support what you're saying. And I would ask the chairman, rhetorically, if this issue had been brought to these folks sitting up here on the dais, we wouldn't be here, would we? You'd be home with your families. The very essence of what Mr. Bernstein said is that we forgot Article 1, Section 8. It doesn't exist in the Constitution. It is the phantom section of the Constitution, which provides very specifically that there is a checks and balance on trade, although there isn't right now. So, Mr. Bernstein, under trade practices, you mentioned these trade practices by China. They're not the only culprit behind job displacement and lower wages. Just this week, a report came out that wages have lagged as corporate profits soar, aided and abetted by we know what. The report was very clear. I'm not here to make a political point. I'm trying to get to the question. The fight for higher wages has been hampered by many times undermining the power of labor. Trump is rolling back regulations, President Trump, that protect workers' safety, benefits, fair wages, overtime pay. His tax bill will encourage more, not less, outsourcing. I can name 5 ways in which it encourages outsourcing. So addressing those workers hurt by trade will not be enough to correct this imbalance. We don't have to have losers in the process of trade or all-out assault on workers by years of policies that have hung them out to dry. What do you suggest, Mr. Bernstein, might help workers hurt by trade?
Well, first of all, while that's not the topic of this hearing, it's an extremely important topic that comes right out of this hearing. I would strongly urge this subcommittee to have a hearing on that question. What should we be doing to help those hurt by trade? We're having a great discussion of what we shouldn't be doing. Let's talk about what we should be doing. Now, my ideas would be to start with the trade deals themselves and to have trade deals that have much higher standards of workers, not just here, but on both sides of the border. Environmental standards, labor standards, consumer standards. I would also ensure that we push back on the kinds of currency interventions that I mentioned in my testimony that make life more difficult for exporters like those on the panel today. Then I would directly help workers who've been displaced by trade by creating jobs for them in their communities. Even at low unemployment, we know there are communities of this country that have still been left behind. Workers who are trying to transition to better jobs need training. We also need to invest in our infrastructure. And there's a very useful program within the Commerce Department called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership that helps small manufacturers and small farmers, small exporters in general, to find supply chains and link up with global trade. The Trump budget zeroes out the MEP. I would go exactly in the opposite direction. So those are just a small set of ideas that I think would help push us in a much better direction in terms of helping those hurt by trade.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it, and I'll yield back the 25 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Nunes is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be quick, but Ms. Jones, I just want to ask you, if you were looking at, knowing that we're in this difficult position with China, I think that ultimately the NAFTA situation will work itself out. Do you have any recommendations for this committee or for USTR of other countries that we could do, that we could make bilateral agreements with, knowing that this administration would like to do additional bilateral agreements, which is what I've tried to push them for? If you could just give us a few ideas, concepts of countries that you'd be interested in.
Certainly, thank you for the question. The U.S. wheat industry has long sought out a bilateral agreement with Japan. They are our most valuable customer for our wheat exports. They are also a valuable customer for other agricultural industries such as beef. We would also, seek out really any bilateral that the administration is willing to pursue. And in light of pulling out of TPP, which is a very important agreement to the wheat industry, any of those countries would be excellent partners to have a bilateral with, whether it be Japan. Vietnam is also another one that has a large and growing middle class that we consider to be a market opportunity for the wheat industry. And certainly improving our trade relationship with China. If you actually ended up with a formal bilateral agreement with China, they're rising middle class, they're a substantial consumer of wheat, and they are also a market opportunity for us that despite some of our issues and our current WTO cases with them, we are eager to pursue as an industry.
Well, I agree. I would like to see us look at a lot of the Asian countries. Japan, Vietnam, Philippines would all be good. Also, potentially the UK, depending on what happens with their withdrawal from the European Union. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask, there's Mr. Boeing, you're in the dairy industry, correct? So you're well aware of the situation with Canada. Canada has been getting a free ride on dairy for a very, very long time. And I do, as having a very large contingent of dairy farmers in my district, I would like to see Canada finally, once and for all, fix this trade imbalance that they have with us with these unfair trade practices, but I'm sure you're aware of these trade practices. What do you think the best remedy for the Canadian-U.S. split would be directly related to the dairy industry?
Best solution, sir?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't made much progress there, as you well know.
Haven't made much progress in a long time.
And we've had the talks, and we've actually talked sometimes with some Canadian folks, and they're very protective of their dairy industry, very protective. And really to have a definite answer, I think we need to work on it. It definitely needs to get fixed, and I understand why we are working on it. But to have a definite solution, sir, I don't know that I have one right now.
It's been very frustrating for many in the dairy industry dealing with Canada after all these years. I think the trade balance on the dairy industry with Mexico has been very good.
Yes, sir.
But with Canada, it's continued to be a problem. But thank you all for your testimony here today on this very important topic. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. So we all have to run across the street and vote. Sadly, I'm going to let you know that it could be close to an hour until we're back. So we'll stand adjourned until we come back and visit with you for another hour or two. Thank you.
Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. C-SPAN, mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check. Mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Ah. Interesting. Yeah. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mic check 1, 2, 3, 4. Good.
The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you for your patience. It doesn't even seem like we were gone, does it? We're going to continue with questioning, and the next person in line is Mr. Levin. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for your patience. We've listened to your testimony eagerly, and I think across the board there's a lot of sympathy for it. Sympathy is maybe the wrong word. Empathy even. But here's the problem. We on the Democratic side have been urging action on China for years against their manipulation of their currency, against their practices in terms of state-owned enterprises on steel and other products. But we never had any help on the now majority side. When it came to currency, there was virtually no support for our effort to take action on China's manipulation of its currency. The same was in terms of using Section 301 that's now being used. We urged it be used, but it wasn't, and we had no help from the majority side virtually. Steel, 10 years ago, China and the U.S. made the same amount of steel. Now China makes 10 times the amount. So when the president was a candidate, he saw a vacuum, and he acted on it. And the problem is that we now have an administration which responded to a gap, but is now essentially saying just sweep the decks, whether it's China, whether it was TPP, which we opposed, and he now says he eliminated it, NAFTA, which many of us opposed 25 years ago, and he has now been holding back and forth as to where he's going. And what makes this problem further is that the majority hesitates to take on the president. So we have a hearing where you come and present some strong testimony, but in terms of taking on the president directly, that doesn't happen. And so there's a very mixed picture. So Mr. Vander Wal, for example, you say, I'm hearing more from farmers as time goes along that they still trust the president knows it, what he's doing, and everything will be fine in the end. I mean, so we're having more or less silence in general as to what the president is doing, which touched some important problems, but now has this helter-skelter, unpredictable, changing policy. And the Republicans, they don't stand up to it in general as they don't really speak strongly. And you kind of give a mixed message. And so I just want to urge people to stand up and be clear, because on the Democratic side, we have been clear for years and years that China presents with its state-owned enterprises, and it's hurting our exports to them. We've made clear, use 301, and yet nothing happened. And when one of you say, let's negotiate, let's talk and not use tariffs, the problem is that we talked and talked and talked. And now tariffs are being used, I'm afraid, beyond a wake-up call and beyond an instrumentality. So I just want to make it clear where we're coming from. I think Democrats will find your testimony pretty important, and we have some understanding of it. What you really need to do is to help us shape a policy that responds to it. And unfortunately, for example, the Farm Bureau, when we talked about China currency and we talked about their 301, you were getting the benefit at the time and you didn't help us. So now we all have to join together to help carve out a policy that makes sense. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for taking time out of your lives to come here with us. I'm sorry we get called out to vote, and we absolutely control nothing in our lives. Once you get elected, everything is pretty much is scheduled for you. When you talked about loss of market share, I think it was you, Mr. Papp, when you talk about loss of market share and try to get market share back, I think it's important that people that actually do what you do, as opposed to people who get elected to represent you, actually walk that walk so they can, when they talk the talk, they actually know what the walk is like. How do you capture market share back once you lose it? And the other thing is with the trade imbalance, do we not have a trade imbalance right now? And it certainly didn't start with this administration. It started many, many years ago. How would you turn it around, and what would you do? What would the levers be that you would use to change it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, you know, we are fortunate that we've had 6 decades of trade surpluses in agriculture. We can grow more than we can use. And with those relationships of those other countries, I've been fortunate to be involved not only through the Farm Bureau, but also through our Minnesota Governor's Office on different trade missions, whether it be to South Korea, China, Vietnam, as well as some other countries, Cuba. And trade relationships, or trade is all about relationships, getting to know your customer, making sure that you're a reliable customer, being there. And as we have those discussions, in Minnesota, we like to think of trade negotiations a little bit like a Minnesota potluck dinner. Everybody's kind of expected to bring something to the table. You know, and you really have to have everybody that can come back with some advantages, with some wins and things like that. And the best way to do that is through those relationships. So I guess we would urge anybody and everybody that's listening how important it is that we maintain those relationships, because once we lose that market, it's really tough to get it back. And you think about that as you do business normally. If you don't get the service, you don't get the product you want, and you go to someone else takes good care of you, you really shouldn't have a reason to go back to that original place. And that's our worry. 60% of the soybeans that I planted last May are exported. I'm reliable of that export market. So we're going to continue to hopefully build those relationships to be at that table. But really, Farm Bill is important to all of us in agriculture. But our true safety net in agriculture, quite frankly, is that international trade, that 95% of our customers that don't live in the United States.
So anybody else have any opinions on how you would gain market share or regain market share once you lose it? I mean, is there any disagreement that right now that there is a huge trade imbalance? Now, not in ag, because I know what we're doing in ag, but we do get hit. And whenever we put a tariff on things, then the response right away is to come back where we're doing well, right? So you want to hit them where it hurts, and it's usually in the wallet. So if there's any other perspective on how you would get there, I got to tell you, I've watched the domestic automobile market shift tremendously, where domestics no longer hold the percentage of market share that they used to have. But I got to tell you, I agree with you. Once you lose market, you don't get it back. It's good to talk about getting it back, but once that horse is out of the barn, it's pretty hard to get back in. What could you do right now today? If you were sitting where we're sitting, if you were sitting and had a chance to talk to the administration, what would you tell them is the best way of regaining market share and holding people accountable that are not towing the line the right way? And listen, I appreciate the fact you can go to the WTO and go through all these different things, and we win the battle, but we've already lost the war because that market's gone. So if anybody else, just something you would tell us if you were able to sit with us and talk either to Mr. Ross or to Mr. Lighthizer or to the President.
Very quickly, I would say get the exchange rates right. And this is something that the administration at least gives lip service to, but when other countries manage their exchange rates to get an advantage over us, it makes our manufacturers have a much harder time competing.
Anybody else? Mr. Boney.
Congressman, I would just say, we've talked a lot today about China. We've talked a lot today about Mexico and Canada And we mentioned a little bit about Japan. Let's work on some more. Let's work on some new trade agreements. I mean, there's opportunities out there. Someone mentioned Japan. Japan is a great market. We need whether we go back and work ourselves back into the TPP or whether we have a bilateral, anything along those lines are things that can help American agriculture. So that's what I would encourage.
I'm just wondering, because when we have the biggest market in the world and everybody in the world wants to compete, they want to come in and have a share of our market, there has to be a way that we can look at what we're doing and how we're helping the people that actually form the market. And that's you all in the ag business, but in other places around our markets now, we're looking at lost market share. So thanks for being here today. I'm sorry we had to step out, but we really appreciate your time to coming here and working with us. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Davis, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is indeed a very interesting discussion. And I guess there's a great deal of fear that many of the individuals that I know who are in business have, that they can't figure out how to get something back once it's lost or if it's slipping. Mr. Bernstein, let me ask you, agriculture is the world's biggest industry. I don't think of anything as large. It is actually what built America and established what we call its greatness over time. If agriculture goes, so goes America. It is the heart and soul of our nation. We spend about 12% of our discretionary income on food, whereas some countries spend about 30 to 40% and even some more of their income. Many of these countries' residents are not able to own their own homes, have cars for transportation, or even able to afford other things in their lives to have a decent living because of the price of food. Mr. Bernstein, you pointed out in your testimony that tariffs imposed by the administration is subject to have little impact in benefits to certain industry sectors, but agriculture would suffer more, where there could be a potential unnaturalization of the farming industry in terms of job loss, export market loss, and lowering commodity prices internationally. If things are not corrected and our administration's gambles is found to not be correct or accurate or not pay off, what picture do you paint for domestic food prices to consumers, and how would this affect our nation's economy?
Well, this has been a unique hearing for me on a positive side, because oftentimes the other members of the panel are other economists, but here we have a bunch of people who actually do stuff. And so if you listen to my fellow panelists, what they're really not saying, because it's embedded in the economics, is that these are very highly productive producers. And that's why those shares that you mentioned in terms of consumer spending are relatively low in this country, because productivity on the farm in America has grown so sharply. And in many ways, what I think I hear my fellow panelists saying is that the system that wasn't broken before the tariffs is being damaged by them. That doesn't mean that everything was perfect, and we've heard the need for better trade deals from both myself and my colleagues here. But I would maintain, and I think it's been a consistent message across the group today, that the tariffs are doing more harm than good in the ag sector. And that's why I've urged this committee, this subcommittee, to reassert its constitutional privilege, and if I might even call it an obligation, to intervene and to take back the privilege and the role of regulating trade and of setting tariffs. Now, I understand that Measures 232 have security issues that are important, but Canada is not a security threat. Neither is Mexico nor the EU. I don't think that's a very courageous foreign policy statement on my point. I think it's obvious. And so these functions are being misused, and I urge the committee to act accordingly.
Thank you very much, and I'd just say that, of course, Illinois, being the tremendous agricultural state that we are, when it comes to soybeans especially, we're kind of shaking in our boots with China. And so we certainly trust that we're going to be able to reconcile some of those difficulties. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Well, this is certainly a topic of great concern. And, you know, I've been listening carefully to your testimony. And Mr. Gebbers, you recognize that, or you brought out that right now there's a 50% tariff on fruit in China and a 10% VAT on top of that. And that VAT existed before all these discussions came about. And Mr. Boning, you brought out that China has been cheating on agricultural subsidies by $100 billion for years, and obviously that's hurt the American farmer. Who here thinks that America has a fair trade arrangement before all the tariffs, before all these came about with China? Who here thinks that's true? What about the EU? What about the EU? Do you think we've got good reciprocal tariffs, that everything's fair in agriculture? No. And certainly Canada with lumber and with dairy, we got problems, correct? And also, I don't think anybody here would argue that we've had problems with steel and aluminum, although that's not your primary, right? I mean, you recognize that China has been treating us unfairly and dumping on us. Now, let me ask you this. We all recognize there's a problem. So here's the second issue. Who here thinks that these countries, if they got the better end of the deal, that they're willingly just going to give up that advantage and just say, you know what, you're right, I'll just sign that off? Mr. Bernstein, you think they're going to do that? No.
No, I do not.
Does anybody here think that? No. And so what's it going to require to get them to give up this advantage? Well, obviously some kind of pressure is going to have to be brought to bear. Now, we can disagree about the type of pressure. I mean, the pressure that's been brought here is tariffs. But to say we're not talking with them, obviously we are. You know, we've got the Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Ross, and we've got Mr. Mnuchin, and we've got Ambassador Lighthizer, who are certainly very experienced financial folks and very experienced in trade, who are trying to get the best deal we can. Mr. Bernstein, you say we need to grab back our constitutional authority, and I don't think we've given it up. We've delegated it to the administration, but who here thinks that 435 people, or 535 if you include the Senate, who thinks 535 people can sit in a room and effectively negotiate a contract? That's right, nobody. We have to have
I don't agree with that.
Oh, you think 535 people who can't even agree the sky's blue can come up with a complex a contract? No, absolutely.
It doesn't have to be 535. It has to be a majority. And I believe there is a majority who would push back on these tariffs.
Well, we have to have a point person. That's just common sense. And I think we've got a really, really good point person. Now, these steel tariffs came about this year. And then there's been follow-up because, and there's been talks and rounds of talks. And people have come to the table and walked away from the table. But they all came about this year. So here we sit, 7th month of the year. Who here thought that all this would get resolved in 7 months? So, look, I am really,
Would the gentleman yield?
No, sir, I only have, if I had more than a minute, I would.
Okay.
But here's the thing. I mean, you guys are in the crosshairs, and nobody wants you in the crosshairs. And you're under pressure, and nobody wants you under pressure. I I want to do anything we can to ameliorate the pressure that you're under. But we all have to understand the big picture. And with these existing tariffs that existed before all this went into place, you know, if China has a 25% tariff on ag and we're exporting 25% of our ag products today, as you pointed out, Mr. Boning, what do you think it would happen if they dropped their tariff or if they lowered it to 10%? Then obviously our exports would go up. So no, the end result here is to try to get a better playing field for you guys. And I feel your pain, and I want to do anything I can to make it speedy and ameliorate it. But we all have to understand that in order for any of this to happen, you know, the administration is doing what I think they have to do in bringing pressure to bear to bring these people to the table. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I go, can I just yield 15 seconds to the ranking member, Mr. Pasquarello?
Mr. Chairman, this has to be said, because if we follow the logic that we just heard from the gentleman, we would have no checks and balances, and we might as well just hand over the whole process to the executive branch of government. What we should be doing is trying to get back what we deserve from the Constitution of Article 1, Section 8, and I yield back my time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All of you here either own an agricultural business or you represent people who do. So no one here seems to support these tariffs. Congressional leaders know that the president is wrong on this issue. And as has been stated previously, the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 is very clear. Congress and not the president was vested with the power to levy tariffs. You can't tariff your way to economic strength and growth. The imposition of tariffs are a race to the bottom. You impose tariffs, another country responds by imposing their own tariffs, and in the end, consumers get hurt because it hurts demand, it hurts profits, and you know this better than anybody else. If Congress wants to stop tariffs, it has one option: pass a law with a veto-proof majority that ends the tariffs or strips the president of his authority to impose tariffs. So while it's somewhat helpful that you're here appealing to your elected representatives to provide you with some relief just so that you can do what it is you do every day to help contribute to the growth and the strength of the American economy, we're not exercising our constitutional authority to help you. You should be indignant about that. From what I heard from your introductions, you've traveled quite a distance here to appeal to Congress about something that's hurting your business directly or the constituencies that you represent. And what Congress is telling you is, despite the fact that it has the constitutional authority to help you, they're not going to help you. They're not going to help you. So, you know, and then, you know, it was a law. It was the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. 1962, Section 232, that allows a president to bypass Congress and impose tariffs under circumstances that threatens the national security. So the president invokes that Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to justify tariffs imposed on Canada. On Canada. Canada has been with us in every single war. Canada is a great trading partner. If we were smart about trade, what we would be doing with Canada is partnering with them to give us greater leverage in negotiating a more favorable North American free trade agreement. You know, everybody here whines about China. Everybody. They cheat on their currency. They treat their environment poorly. They treat their workers poorly. Well, you know what you ought to do with China? Stand up and compete with them. Because they're bypassing, because they're doing what we used to do. to strengthen the American economy. You look at your smartphone, the internet, global positioning satellite, touchscreen technology. Guess where all that came from? The American taxpayers that financed research to make those products possible. Guess where all the smartphones are made? They're made in China. So we just need to be smarter about trade policy and economic policy. You can't tariff your way to economic strength and growth. What you can do, and what we ought to be doing, particularly this body and this subcommittee, is promoting investment in the growth of the American economy. I apologize to you for coming here and appealing to Congress that is constitutionally authorized to help you and is failing to help you. In a Senate bill, it's insulting that the Senate passes overwhelmingly by 88 votes a bill which is a non-binding recommendation on this stuff.
Gentleman's time
when
is
in fact
expired.
it has a constitutional authority to do it. I
Mr.
yield
Paulson
back.
is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and sharing your personal stories. Mr. Papp, I'll just start with you. Being from Minnesota, you're the third largest, Minnesota being the third largest producer of soybeans in the country. It's our farmers who have been planting soybeans well before the current trade disputes have been in place and well before China announced a 25% tariff on U.S. soybeans. So prices for soybeans, I know, are down, $1.50 or more actually per bushel. They're continuing to drop. You got farmers facing uncertainty, knowing they got to harvest those crops in the fall, but they're not going to have access to the foreign markets that they've come to rely on. You've each shared your perspective on that. I think that that uncertainty that our farmers are facing from these tariffs, it just isn't hindering their ability to provide for their family, but it's hurting the broader community. Projects being put on hold, and it's hurting our economy on a broader perspective. Mr. Papp, let me just ask you, as a fourth-generation farmer, do you think that these tariffs will hinder future generations of farmers from a long-term perspective and make it more difficult for the family farm to be handed down, putting us in a tougher situation for a long-term impact on the farming community?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Paulson, I think that's a great question. The driveway that Julie and I drove down yesterday on the way to the airport was the same driveway our family used 119 years ago. Personally, except for college, in my lifetime, I've only ever lived in 3 houses on 2 farmyards a half a mile from each other. We've got our 5th generation, our son Andy, who's farming half a mile down the road, living in a house that his great-grandfather built, sleeping in the same bedroom his grandfather was born in, as that 5th generation in agriculture. And quite frankly, Julie, we hope they're working on that 6th generation at some time as well. And what we need, what that safety net is trade to continue. As we have young farmers and ranchers wanting to get in, it's hard to get started in agriculture, even as an existing family. And farmers and ranchers are all about sustainability. But the most important sustainability in agriculture with farm families is that generational sustainability, that ability to continue on the next 119 years. And I really worry that we don't have that ability as we're not taking advantages of markets that we've got. We had some great opportunities in TPP. We've chose not to do that, but that doesn't mean the other 11 countries aren't going on ahead without us. So we're really concerned about that. One way to do that is livestock. That's caring for animals. That's the best way for that next generation to get in. We've looked at that. I brought with me today a proposal, that my son did to build a hog barn, okay? But where the prices are today, that's not going to cash flow. That's not going to work. And you'd be surprised how much steel and aluminum is in animal housing as we talk about the costs going up and up. So we really look at trade as that ability to not only survive this next year, but for the next generations to survive as well. What other industry would give up on 95% of their market share, would say, I don't care about that 95%. We really need to work together to see what we can do to keep that next generation involved in the farm if they wish to.
Maybe just to follow up on that, because you said the safety net for a lot of farmers has been trade. Some have said the United States doesn't need to worry about retaliation against agriculture. You talked about it being the tip of the spear, but some have said, look, countries aren't going to want to increase their prices. They're not going to care about decreasing supply through retaliation. Would you agree with that argument?
We have got, we're blessed. We've got the ability to produce more than we need. We need those other countries. We hope we'll have those relationships where we'll continue to be able to trade with them. And again, everybody has to have something in that trade agreement. But we would still urge anybody that will listen that we need to be at the table. We need to have those negotiations because, quite frankly, that not only is our future in the next few months, but it's that next generation's future in agriculture as well.
Mr. Boney, you want to add anything in the last 20 seconds, just to sum up?
Just that, I mean, I can second everything Kevin said. I mean, we're kind of in the same boat. We're multi-generational as well, farming land that my grandfather started farming in 1930. I have one son there with us. But long term, this is how we've progressed. This is how we've gone forward, is because we've been blessed. Kevin pointed it out so well. But we have to have those trade agreements, whether it's China or whether it's Japan or whatever it is, we need them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Snow, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question would be for Mr. Vanderwall, and I'm going to call you Scott because it seems weird to call you Mr. Vanderwall when I know you so well. But here's what's frustrating for me is because I look at the reason that this is a crisis right now is because we've gone through 4 or 5 years of really low commodity prices. And if we had perfect trade agreements and our ag products were able to get into every market across the globe and we were treated fairly, we probably wouldn't have had as low of markets the last 4 or 5 years. Is that correct? I mean, the President Trump correctly identified that we needed to fight for better trade agreements. Would you agree with that?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Noem, yes, I would agree with that. I think we've kind of been beat out historically in some of these trade agreements, and admittedly, there are higher tariffs on our products going the other way than they are coming this way.
Exactly. I agree wholeheartedly, and that's why this coming at this time creates such a crisis, is because we've been living with unfair trade agreements. We've been paying the price, and our farmers and ranchers have been dealing with that when previous administrations did not fight for the American farmer. This president's fighting for him, and China knew directly where we were the most vulnerable. They came after our farmers and ranchers. So it gets me upset when I talk about people indicating that it's the president not defending our farmers and ranchers because he was out there fighting for better trade agreements and China came after us. Now our job is to tell the story about why we need a safety net. If we're going to win for better trade agreements, then we need the help of the administration, the help of USDA, the help of Congress to make sure that our farmers and ranchers in this country are able to continue to provide the food supply for this country and for the world and do what they do best. And that's the message that I have a tough time delivering up here sometime. I've spent my whole life in agriculture, but it is very difficult for anybody who hasn't. They don't understand how highly leveraged the industry is. So when you get in a state like South Dakota and you're borrowing money to buy land, then you're borrowing money to buy machinery, and then you go back to the bank and you borrow money to operate, to put seed, fertilizer, chemical in the ground and hope there's something to harvest that fall. That's a highly leveraged industry. And the impact that this situation could have, not just on those operations that have been in families for generations, but the impact it has on those communities and those counties and those states, that's something that I think is very difficult for people on Capitol Hill to really grasp how important it is that we do something and we do it quickly.
Will the general
Is there
lady
something?
yield?
No, I won't yield right now because I want Mr. Vanderwall to talk about the reality of the situation on the ground in South Dakota and how tenuous this financial situation is.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Noem. That's a great question, and it really impacts our state. You know, we've got decreasing population in our rural areas already, and if we lose any more population in the state, in these rural areas, not only does it take the young farmers and ranchers that leave, or like I mentioned, the retiring or almost retiring people like my age and a little older, it also takes out the people that supply those farmers and ranchers, the feed store, the fertilizer dealer, all the people that supply the things that we need to raise the products that we do. So yes, it has a tremendously long tail, and it's not only those feed and seed suppliers, it's the hardware stores, it's the food stores that are in these small towns.
And everybody in this country relies on a safe and an affordable food supply. It doesn't matter if you live in New York, California, you care that when you go to the grocery store that you can afford to buy that loaf of bread, that carton of eggs to feed your family. And that's what is incredibly important about these rural areas, continuing to grow our food. That's the message I've carried out here on Capitol Hill, is that we can't afford to let another country grow our food for us, because if they provide our food for us, then they control us. And so it's incredibly important that not only do we fight and continue to fight for better trade agreements and more market access, but we get through this situation too that allows us to be victorious. I appreciate you being here. I know you guys are away from your operations, away from your families, to be here and advocate for good policy and good trade. And it means the world to us, and it means the world to our country. So thank you for what you do. God bless you.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule and being here. Being a fourth-generation owner of our family ranch, I relate to a lot of you in these issues. But Mr. Vanderwall, you spoke about several of the tariffs, like the tariffs on soybeans. Who put those tariffs on the soybeans?
You mean
Was it the Trump administration, or was it the Chinese?
The Chinese have put the tariffs on the soybeans in retaliation for the tariffs that have been put on their products coming this way.
That's the excuse that they said. But I want to point out that the Trump administration did not put the 25% tariff on soybeans or cotton or corn or the other ag products. It was the Chinese. And we can't lose that direction. We have a president, and I think it's an important distinction that needs to be made by those of us on this committee, because farmers, ranchers, and workers in southern Missouri have been on an uneven playing field for quite some time. President Trump knows this, and that is why he has asked USTR and Secretary Ross to investigate and fight back against these unfair trade practices. We know 95% of the world's consumers are outside the United States, and we all believe in free trade and fair trade. Countries shouldn't be putting tariffs on us. Our president is wanting policies where there's no tariffs on either side. We can compete with the world if it's fair, and if they're not leveraging tariffs on us. The problem is for so long we've had elected officials that said they're free traders, but they're afraid to stand up to the Chinese and other countries that are putting these tariffs on our ag products. We complain about low commodity prices. It's because we don't have these free trade agreements with other countries, because they want to protect their own industry. You know, USTR and Secretary Ross, they found several things after the president asked for it. In fact, the American dairy farmers face astronomical tariffs levied by Canada. India is heavily subsidizing their rice industry. Turkey is dumping cotton, and many other countries, through tariffs or non-trade barriers or straight-up blockades, are harming our farmers and ranchers. That cannot be unnoticed. The 301 investigations into China found numerous trade violations and theft of intellectual property from Americans. They say in China there's two types of businesses. There's two types of businesses in China: government-owned businesses and government-subsidized businesses. That's tough to compete as a farmer in southeast Missouri whenever the Chinese two businesses are government-owned and government-subsidized. The entire world knows China is taking advantage of them, but it seems that President Trump is the only one who wants to do something about it. He wants a better deal for Missouri farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and families. So that's how our trade actions came about: lengthy investigations and specific responses to unfair trade practices. Does anyone know how the European Union decided to levy our tariffs on us, Mr. Gibbers? Do you know how the European Union decided to levy the tariffs on our ag products?
I don't know the exact process, but I do know that they use several methods to both phytosanitarily and monetarily.
Let me read to you what the European Union said in a statement. Here's the European Union's trade chief. He just recently, quote, said, "It is well known that the agriculture constituency is one of the few groups with political clout to bring about change in Washington, and it is no coincidence that all the U.S. main trading partners have selected agriculture products for their rebalancing list." That is the trade chief of the EU openly saying they are targeting American farmers and rural communities for pure political reasons. Does that sound like our friends and allies? Targeting you all for political reasons. We need to have friends and neighbors that do want free trade. And I'm very supportive of President Donald Trump trying to make sure that my farmers in Southeast Missouri has the highest commodity prices possible. And it's gonna be a roller coaster. And it has been a roller coaster. And as a rancher myself, who just sold 31 steers today, I understand how the market changes very quickly. And I'm telling you, I am very glad that I have someone in the White House that I trust that's willing to stand up for our farmers. And we're gonna get to a good agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Wolarski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the panel for coming. I want to just echo that everything that you've said rings true in my district in northern Indiana. And I just want to give a shout out to Mr. Bernstein for mentioning the RV industry. We have the majority of the industry in our district. So when we talk about 232 and some of those issues, it's raining even more clear. But the folks in my district in northern Indiana, the farmers, I have a friend of mine named Harold Parker, summed it up with one word. When asked about what's happening right now with these tariffs in northern Indiana, and he said the results are terrible. His gross income per acre dropped $100. He grows corn, soybeans, seed corn, and tomatoes as a way to diversify and provide a buffer if one of those is having a bad year. The problem is that right now, everything is down. Another family farm in my district grows 3,200 acres of corn and 3,000 acres of soybeans, estimates they've lost $700,000 in gross income since June 1st because of the price drops in both. One thing I've heard Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross repeatedly say is essentially this, quote, "Well, if China's buying more Brazilian soybeans, the U.S. can just sell to wherever Brazil isn't selling anymore." Basically, he's saying that U.S. agriculture can fill the void wherever Brazil and others are abandoning in order to sell to China or the EU. Is it really that simple? Is it really just the one brushstroke away? And if not, I don't care who reins in on it. Can I just ask you to talk about it? Why is it not that simple?
Thank you for the question.
Sure.
It is not that simple. There will be a certain amount of rebalancing the world supply, but there are two things that you don't want to happen. We do not want to give up and be a residual supplier to China. They're the biggest consumer of protein in the world, and they are also a huge opportunity for the wheat market, and that is not something that we want to give up and be a residual supplier. The other thing that makes that a little bit more difficult is that there are sanitary, phytosanitary regulations that mean it may not be necessarily possible to take U.S. soybeans, U.S. wheat, whatever it is, and then automatically send it to Brazil, Argentina, whatever the void in the market is. It's not necessarily a straightforward, we just ship it all to Argentina and then really it could go to China. Those type of regulations could impede how that plays out in the world market.
Anybody else want to comment?
As simplistic as it seems, these markets are not fungible by any means. And we would never want to forego the opportunity to sell to, say, the Chinese customer. They're very discerning. I mean, don't get me wrong. They understand the products that they buy from us, and they're willing to pay for those products. I've been an athlete my whole life, and there's no handicaps in athletics. You have to have fundamentals and confidence to execute on a level playing field. That's why there's rules. That's why there's boundaries and lines on a football field or on a basketball court. Nobody handicapped Larry Bird. He earned that right to be an all-star. And that's all we're asking is let's level this playing field. And I get where we're headed. I'm patriotic, and I get how there's going to be some pain shared. Make sure the pain's shared amongst all industries. It's $1 trillion of high-tech money sitting overseas. Make sure they're sharing in the pain of this IP protection, because agriculture is high profile. To answer Mr. Smith's question, we're high profile. We're easy. There's an apple grown in darn near every state, so it's easy to get under the skin of your ag producers and make a difference. That's why we're here. But these markets are not fungible, so we can't just pick up and send an apple as an apple and as apple. There's no way it works that way.
I appreciate it. And I just wanted to pass along to you all what I tell my farmers every day. Indiana is the 5th largest exporter in the country, and this matters so much to the majority of the farms in Indiana that are family farms. And, you know, a lot of them a couple of weeks ago said, hey, you know what, we'll do the short-term pain for the long-term gain. But just last week when I had a little summit with a lot of my farmers, they're nervous. They're nervous that the long-term gain here may be much longer than what they thought, and they can't ride this through. But I just want to thank you for what you do. You know, there's very few professions, I think, that I can honestly say, having been raised and currently living in a rural area, that I really honor, to really say that you take so much risk. And for the generations that are sitting here, you've taken so much risk through the generations, and to basically engage and be responsible for a global food supply. And for that, I thank you. We want to do everything that we can to have your back and to make sure that our ag economy continues to roll forward with a lot of strength. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for what you do. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kind.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panelists for your testimony coming here and giving us some insight what the tariffs are doing to your businesses, production agriculture. I know has been the focus. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this hearing. Obviously, there's a complex issue at play right now with our relationship with the rest of the world when it comes to trade policy, and we're inevitably going to have to tee up more hearings to get more feedback as far as working with all of you to find a safe landing zone for all this so that we don't mess up the economic recovery that's occurring in our country right now. But with all due respect, we haven't heard anything new today than what each of us are hearing in our districts each and every day. I come from one of the largest agriculture producing districts in the nation throughout western Wisconsin, one of the biggest dairy producing nations, and I hear from farmers every day and manufacturers and the concern that consumers are raising right now too. And so this isn't much new news that we're getting here with your testimony. It's consistent, if that brings you any comfort, but I think the president's underappreciating what the impact has been. Just the PR war he's losing terribly back home in my state in Wisconsin. Let me just read to you a few of the media headlines of late. Trump's tariffs, Wisconsin manufacturers hit by trade policy, discuss plight with Senator Ron Johnson. Trump's global trade war expected to inflict economic casualties in Wisconsin and across the nation. Wisconsin construction seeing cost increases following steel and lumber tariffs. Wisconsin cheesemakers facing double whammy. Tariffs, other costs raise home building prices. Harley-Davidson, stung by tariffs, shifting some production overseas. And then an article about how Trump responded to our iconic company in Wisconsin, and on and on and on. And so you're wondering, where do we go from here? And one thing that's lacking from this panel today is an official from the Trump administration to give us clear guidance of where the landing zone is, what the objectives are, what are we asking of China at the end of the day, what are we demanding of the EU at the end of the day, because we have very little to go on right now, and that must frustrate all of you right now, that we don't know where this could possibly end in a good way. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I don't see it ending very well soon or very safely. Because we're in a tit-for-tat situation now where each side is escalating the retaliation, and the Trump administration apparently is throwing out the global rules-based trading system that we helped create since the end of the Second World War. And they become addicted to tariffs, they're addicted to protectionism, and they don't believe in trying to go out and negotiate trade agreements that could solve a lot of these problems. Mr. Boehning, I was struck, by your testimony about hopefully there's an end game in this and the fact that China's been cheating. There's unanimous agreement, bipartisan, that China hasn't been playing by the rules when it comes to IP theft, when it comes to subsidizing their own agriculture production, when it comes to forced technology transfers or the requirement of joint ventures. We all know that. But the proper course of action is to bring that to the WTO. Not to unilaterally hit China, which makes it easy for them to retaliate against us, which they are doing. And you all know, and Mr. Vandervelde, you especially were eloquent in saying they know how to do it and they know how to hurt us. And usually it's in production agriculture. In the previous administration, under President Obama, filed more WTO complaints than any other previous administration. He had a 100% win record with the WTO. The current administration has filed just a few, and a majority of them were previous Obama administration complaints. That would have been, I submit, the proper venue in order to take on China, which we have done consistently at WTO and won, rather than taking this unilateral tariff action against them today. And yet, this administration is doing everything they can to undermine the effectiveness of WTO dispute resolution. They refuse to appoint judges to the appellate panel, and within a few short months, that whole organization will be shut down. They won't be able to do any business. And then it is a dog-eat-dog world out there. And that's what we have to look forward to, unless we figure out a way to do it. Path forward. Congress needs to reassert our authority. I've just introduced bipartisan legislation with Mike Gallagher that calls for the Corker bill here on the House side. We can hope that we can get some support from the outside community about Congress needing to have a greater voice in what's being done. I also introduced legislation earlier this year that calls for a Congressional Review Act so that Congress has a chance to disapprove of what the administration is doing, whether it's 232 or 301 or just the unilateral tariffs that he's applying to the rest of the world. So there are some steps forward, but it's going to require a Congress willing to assert ourselves in a more meaningful fashion in developing trade policy rather than just punting to this guy who is addicted to tariffs. I'm afraid that's just going to end badly for all of us. And again, I thank you all for testifying and your involvement in this issue, but we've got a lot of work to do right here in the U.S. Congress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. Mr. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be here today, and certainly thank you to our witnesses for sharing your insight and expertise. I'm glad that it was pointed out that you are practitioners in agriculture, and not just economists saying how things ought to be or could be, but how things really are. And I think it's important. I think that this entire debate on trade has generated more discussion across our country. And I think we can be better off for it. It makes a lot of us nervous, certainly as you reflect on that. And meeting with some folks back home, the Kelly Bean Company, for example, they're buyers in the dry bean market, and have a great insight. They're concerned about their situation, reflecting certainly the concerns of the producers that they work with. And so, Mr. Vanderwall, I appreciate your testimony. You pointed out how certainly you appreciate President Trump's efforts, and a part of the concern here is this is all in the context that agriculture has not enjoyed, as you said, the economic uptrend that perhaps other parts of our economy have. And so in that entire context, I think it is very important that we address these issues in a timely fashion, hopefully, because we have a lot of things to work on. And certainly just in the trade arena, I think there is a greater understanding of trade, greater appreciation for trade. I think there is a greater appreciation for fair trade. The President has certainly pointed to that. And so, again, Mr. Vanderwall, it looks like from your bio and certainly your background that you're familiar with Brazil, a pretty staunch trading competitor that we have, certainly in soybeans. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate as much as you can on what these trade issues mean to market share and perhaps what other countries might do, particularly Brazil, in this context.
Thank you, Congressman. I wonder if I could respectfully yield my time to Mr. Baining, because he has to leave, if he would be able to answer your question, and then I could come back and address it.
Sure.
Thank you, Scott. Related to Brazil and as a competitor, I mean, there's no doubt that they're a very, very staunch competitor. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And what was your question again, Congressman? Exactly what was the question?
Well, just reflecting on market share, as was highlighted briefly earlier, what that means perhaps to the typical producer.
Well, we're going to, if we lose those markets, a competitor like Brazil will be in there right away. I mean, they are a very staunch competitor, and they'll pick up our market share readily. And if they become the supplier that's most reliable, it'll be hard to get that market back. I mean, I think Mr. Papp pointed that out earlier. To get those markets back will be severely difficult. There's no doubt about that.
Appreciate that. Anyone else wishing to reflect on that?
Mr. Chairman, I do need to leave. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, but I'm headed back to the farm tonight yet. So, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Vanderwall.
Yes, Congressman, thank you for the question, and I would just elaborate a little bit more on that, and thank you for the latitude to let Mr. Boehning speak. Like you noticed in my biography, I've been in Brazil 3 times. It's very interesting the way they look at the United States. And this goes back to 2001, originally, when we still had set-aside programs and all that. And the statement was made by those people that we watch the United States very carefully, and every time you set aside some acres or take acres out of production, we just expand that much. And so they look at these kinds of things too. If we lose our markets with China or whoever else it is, they will go after those markets, just like Mr. Boehning said. So they're hungry for our markets, and they're not afraid to compete. And that's why we need to have this level playing field to be able to compete with them.
Sure. And I do want to say that, tariffs and their negative impact ultimately on consumers has me greatly concerned, and certainly the impact on producers as well. But also non-tariff trade barriers. We should not lose sight of the fact that we need to address non-tariff trade barriers, that trade agreements, be they bilateral or multilateral, those are important to address bad trade policies that can be on the books. Let's update NAFTA. Let's get this moving just as quickly as we can. Let's bring as many of these trade concerns to an end, get this resolved so that we can move forward and hopefully see more prosperity for American agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrillo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing my participation today, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us. I'm very sympathetic to many of the concerns you all have regarding the negative effects of the retaliatory tariffs. But I want to share similar concerns small business owners in South Florida have with these U.S. tariffs and the response from the Chinese. The Florida Keys represent the largest commercial seaport in the state of Florida and represent enormous economic value to Florida and Monroe County. Next to tourism, commercial fishing is the second largest economic engine in the Keys, valued with turnover at $900 million. $300 million of that amount is directly attributable to the harvest of spiny lobster. That was part of a letter sent to me yesterday by Captain Bill Kelly, Executive Director for the Florida Keys Commercial Fishermen's Association. One of the Florida Keys economic engines is at risk of being stalled as China begins to impose retaliatory tariffs on all seafood products imported from the United States. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit into the record the referenced Florida Keys Fishermen's Association letter sent yesterday regarding U.S. tariffs and Chinese retaliatory actions. I would also like to submit into the record the letter I sent to the President yesterday regarding the same issue.
Without objection.
Last year's hurricane season was difficult for many communities in South Florida, especially for Florida Keys fishermen. Fishermen are still struggling with loss of income, repairs, and recovery of property, replacing expensive lobster traps. I fear the small gains made since the end of the hurricane season are in peril as China retaliates on our fishermen's exports. Shortly after the administration's tariffs under Section 301 went into effect, China retaliated with a 25% tariff on its own list of imports for American items, including Florida spiny lobsters and many of the agriculture items mentioned in the hearing. Florida Keys fishermen are worried these retaliatory tariffs will have a negative economic effect on their livelihoods and that they will never again be able to regain their market share in China even after a hypothetical successful negotiation to decrease tariffs. It's worth noting some of the fishermen in my district export up to 75% of their spiny lobsters to China. While I agree with the administration that China should be held accountable for damaging U.S. businesses with unfair trade practices, this retaliation is also a source of great harm to many of our fishermen and farmers. Instead, we should be working with our allies, Canada, the EU, and Mexico, to implement a more targeted approach that will both address China's unfair trade practices and help restrain retaliation, providing our fishermen, farmers, and workers with a level of certainty and helping our communities and your communities return to economic prosperity. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for all of the testimony we've heard here today. And I think when people think of American farmers, they think of a more traditional farming like the ones that have been highlighted today. But there are a lot of other people throughout the country, fishermen and others, who are already facing the consequences of this growing trade dispute. And I just wanted to come here to add my voice to all of the voices we've heard today, and to really encourage the administration to try to bring this plane in for a landing, because there are many Americans and American families, not just consumers, but people like these fishermen in the Florida Keys who are already being aggrieved, and especially at a time when my district is still trying to recover after the powerful storm, Hurricane Irma, that hit us last year. We can't take more pain at this time. So we really hope that working together, Republicans and Democrats, with the administration, with so many stakeholders from throughout the country, we can all figure this out as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and thank you all for your testimony and for your patience in waiting for us to come back from our responsibilities in voting. I think you've heard obviously from both sides today. There's a little frustration expressed, and all of us, I think, wanting more communication with the administration. That is not unique to this administration. It occurred during the Obama administration also, as we were discussing trade issues, and I was proud to be a part of the President's Export Council and had the opportunity to participate in those discussions. But it doesn't matter how many times we have Mr. Lighthizer here, or Mr. Ross, or Mr. Navarro, or have opportunities to meet with the President and the Vice President, et cetera. We're going to always want more. And that's just what our responsibility is, to increase that conversation between the administration and the members that represent our constituency. So the other thing I sort of caught was Mr. Bernstein's comment about the honor of testifying with people that do stuff. And so part of our responsibility is not just trying to communicate with the White House and with the people that work there and making sure that this does have a smooth landing, as Mr. Carbello pointed out, but the other part of our job, even though Mr. Kine recognized immediately that we are hearing these things from our district, as Mr. Gerber knows, coming from Washington State, those of us who represent districts in Washington State are hearing those stories. But what's important is you're sharing those stories today in Washington, D.C., in an open hearing where people around the country and around the world can hear your stories and hear your testimony and hear our concerns and our questions. And then most importantly, it's another way of communicating with the administration, because they also watch these hearings and they listen and they learn from what you said and what we've said and what our questions are. And that also then gives us the opportunity to continue that dialogue and say, hey, by the way, did you catch the hearing on the Trade Subcommittee today? And we will continue to fight. Both parties will continue to fight, because we want to see you succeed. We want to help the people that do stuff, and that's our job. The first job is to listen to you, and then to find a solution to help you keep doing stuff and to help your family keep doing stuff. So thank you again for taking the time to be here today. Thank you so much for the work that you do. As Ms. Noem said, thank you so much for what you do for this country. It is indeed a calling. I have relatives who, in Montana and Minnesota, was born in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, by the way, who farmed their whole lives, and I still have some relatives in Montana doing that same thing. So I know that some of you are in harvest season. Mr. Banning had to go back to his farm, or you're preparing for harvest season. So thank you for taking the time again to be here. Please be advised that members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made a part of the formal hearing record. Our record will remain open until August 1st, and I urge interested parties to submit statements to inform the committee's consideration of the issues discussed today. With that, subcommittee stands adjourned.